Hello students, let us begin with the mock analysis of the actual CAT 2023 paper, the English section, slot 1. First things first, we're going to begin with, of course, discussing the passage, knowing what exactly is it that the gist of the passage is, and then, of course, move on to the questions to be able to know why a certain answer and why not. So the passage essentially explores a shift in post-colonial literature from a nation-centered narrative to one that embraces a very broader, a very oceanic worldwide, specifically through the Indian Ocean. While early post-colonial novels often focused on national identity and allegories of the nation, this approach was sometimes limiting. The book, Writing Ocean Worlds, examines how authors like Amitav Ghosh, Gurna, Lindsay Collin, and Joseph Conrad reimagine the world by centering their stories around the Indian Ocean, depicting it as a dynamic space of movement, cultural exchange, and South-South connectivity. These authors present alternative geographies and histories, focusing on the Islamic culture, the characters of color, and port cities such as the Malindi, Mombasa, Aden, Java, and Bombay, rather than the traditional Western centers like Paris and New York. This literary remapping challenges dominant Euro American narratives and highlights a Southern cosmopolitan culture. It also reshapes the representation of Africa, portraying Africans, Indians, and Arabs as a key historical actor in trade, migration, and activism. However, the narratives do not romanticize the past, acknowledging the realities of forced migration, gendered oppression, and slavery. Instead, they emphasize on the active role and the historical depth of the Indian Ocean world in the global history. So that is essentially what the passage is about. A very easy, a very historic sort of a passage is what we have at hand. Let's get on to the questions to be able to see why and answer it, why not. Now this says, which one of the following statement is not true about migration in the Indian Ocean? It has to be not true, which means it has to be an option that will have to be false. Now let's begin with the Indian Ocean world's migration networks connected the global north with the global south. Now, of course, this seems to be our answer because this is definitely not true about the migration. Now, if you go back to the second paragraph in the passage and as quoted, it says, this has the effect of remapping the world in the reader's mind as centered in the interconnected global south. So the passage only talks about the south-south connection and does not mention a north-south connection. So this is clearly not said. If it is not said, it is likely to be an answer. Let's see the other ones. Geographical location rather than geographical proximity determine the choice of the destination of migrants. Of course, this has been clearly stated in paragraph 3, wherein the line says, for much of history, travel by sea was much easier than by land, which meant the port cities were far apart, were more often easily connected to each other than to much closer inland cities. So this is true. If it is true, it can't be my answer. Migration in the Indian Ocean world was an ambivalent experience. Now, again, this is also true because paragraph 5 states that migration is often a matter of force. Travel is portrayed as abandonment rather than adventure. So this shows the ambivalence, that is, the contemplation that one has. So this cannot be an answer. The Indian Ocean world's migration network were shaped by religious and commercial histories of the region. I think this was the very bedrock. This was the very, foundation of the passage. Option D has been stated in paragraph 4, wherein the line reads as the novels in my book highlight, instead of a largely Islamic space, features, colors, characters of colors, centralized the ports of Malindi, Mombasa, Aden, Java, and Bombay. So, of course, we can find out that it was shaped by religious and commercial histories. This is true. This cannot be an answer, which means A is what becomes the correct answer. Okay, let's move on to the next. All of the following claim contribute to the remapping discussed in the passage except. So whenever you're looking for an except answer, it means which of the following is going to be false. So 3 of the options are going to be true. One of it is going to be false. We have to find which of the following is now going to be false. Indian Ocean novels have reached beyond the specifics of national concerns to explore rich regional past. Now, the moment you read this passage, Of course, this is going to be correct because this has been clearly stated in the passage. Cosmopolitanism originated in West and traveled to the East through globalization. Now, of course, this is not what the passage seems to be talking about. Now, hear me out. The entire term Indian Ocean world in the passage refers to the interconnected maritime realm of the global south, which encompasses the East Africa, the Arab coast, the South, and the East Asia. These regions maintained a very enduring connection, which is facilitated by sea voyages across the Indian Ocean. The passage then contends that the global south served as an initial hub of globalization, right? So historical and archaeological evidence suggests that the origins of the globalization can actually be traced back to the Indian Ocean. And there's been emphasis that early international trade and commerce were not exclusively dominated by the white Europeans. And then there's also a mention in the passage that goes about by saying that the novels in my book highlight instead a large Islamic space. So over here, clearly, when I say cosmopolitanism originated in the West, and no, so the West were not a forte of this entire narrative. So this is likely to be an answer because this is false as per the passage. The global South as opposed to the global North was the first center of globalization. Yes, this is going to contribute to the remapping because it changed the very dynamics of how the world is. The world of early international trade and commerce was not the sole domain of the white Europeans. Yes, this is how the narrative changed and it actually contributed to the remapping as discussed in the passage, which means the correct answer will have to be option B. So there was absolutely no regard or no accolade that was being given to the West. Let's move on to the next. On the basis of the nature of the relationship between the items in each pair below, choose the odd pair out. Okay, now we simply to go back to the passage and see which of the following is correct. Indian Ocean world and slavery. Yes, this was a very volatile connection that was talked about in the passage. Can't be my answer. Post-colonial novel, anti-colonial nationalism. While discussing the gist of it, we had this combo. Indian Ocean novels, outward looking. Yes, they had an unconventional way or radical way of thinking. Yes. Post-colonial novels, border crossing. Now, this is not the relationship that has been talked about in the passage. So clearly, it becomes the odd pairing for us. All of the following statements, if true, would weaken the passage's claim about the relationship between mainstream English language fiction and Indian Ocean novels, except. So again, you'll have to give me the one option that is false, which means all of these are going to weaken except for one. So very likely there's going to be one answer which is going to strengthen the idea. We simply have to see which of the following is going to strengthen, because if it's an exception, it will have to be strengthened. Now, beginning with, most mainstream English language novels have historically privileged the Christian white male experience of travel and adventure. If you read through this, this definitely strengthens the idea in the passage. In paragraph 4, there has been a mention that goes about by saying that for their part, Ghosh, Gunra, Colin, and even Conrad reference a different set of histories and geographies that are most commonly found in the fiction of India. Those are mostly centered around Europe and US, assume a background of Christianity and whiteness, and there's a mention that this takes place in Paris and New York. So this has been mentioned in the passage. But the kind of relationship that we have to hurt is the passage has established a relationship between mainstream English language fiction and Indian Ocean novels. We have to find the one option that is going to strengthen this further. So of course, when I go about by saying most mainstream English novels have historically privileged the Christian, so this is of course strengthening the fact that yes, all of the mainstream English fiction was definitely in accordance with, the kind of ideologies that the Indian Ocean novels had. So this is definitely strengthening the idea, which means this is definitely going to be my answer. Let's try B. So let's reserve this. Let's try B. The depiction of Africa in most Indian African novels is driven by an Orientalist imagination of its cultural crudeness. Now, this is going to weaken the idea that we have because the passage states that the Indian Ocean novels were influenced by Western imagination of its culture. Now, this, as per the passage and specifically as in the paragraph, wherein it says that for most part of Ghosh, Gunra, and Colin and Conrad reference a different set of histories and geographies that the ones most commonly found in fiction and history. So now over here, the moment you see that the depiction of the Africa is the most, so of course this is going to weaken because this speaks about Africa, but we need to be speaking about how it is supposed to be the Indian Ocean novel. So this cannot be an answer because this is weakening. The depiction of Africa in most Indian Ocean novels is driven by a post-colonial nostalgia for an idyllic past. I mean, the same reasoning can go for this as well. Now, the passage, of course, states that they A had an inward looking. Specifically, especially, this is not true as it has been stated in the same lines. And the passage says that it is a densely imagined, richly sensory image of the southern cosmopolitan culture that provides for an enlarged sense of place in the world. So, of course, this definitely weakens because, again, this is not trying to be talking about the relationship between the mainstream language fiction and Indian Ocean. So, this is weakened. If it is weakened, it's not my answer. Few mainstream English language novels have historically been set in American and Europe metropolitan centers. Now, of course, this is also going to weaken the idea that we have because most of those centered around the Europe and the US, assuming the same background. So of course, by saying that they few mainstream were said, that is going to be wrong because this should have been most. So this is also weakening, which means there's only one answer that we have, and the correct answer will have to, of course, be option A. I hope all of this was absolutely clear for you. And with that, let us all move on to the next passage that we have. All right, everybody, let's get on to the next passage. The first things first, of course, let's talk about the idea of the passage. Now, the passage reflects on the enduring impact of the Marshall Sahlins 1972 essay, The Original Affluent Society, especially in light of his recent death. Sahlins challenged conventional economic thought by arguing that foragers, contrary to popular belief, lived comfortably with minimal labor, enjoying more leisure than people in agricultural or industrial societies. He famously described them as working bankers' hours, prioritizing freedom, leisure, and choice over accumulation and production. Salins used the example of contemporary foragers like the Hadza of Tanzania to emphasize that such societies actively choose their way of life, demonstrating cultural self determination rather than victimhood or evolutionary inferiority. His essay was not just an anthropological study, but a philosophical critique of consumerism, capitalism, and the Western idea of progress. Drawing inspiration from John Kenneth, The Affluent Society, Salin offered a very radical alternative. Foragers pursued affluence not by acquiring more, but by desiring less, what he called the Zen road to affluence. Although aspects of the essay have aged, such as its limited engagement with colonial violence or its occasional romanticism of Rajas, it remains a powerful thought experiment. It urges readers to imagine different inhabitable ways of life and critiques the ethnocentric beliefs that Western capitalist societies represent the pinnacle of progress. So that is what the passage is about, a very different sort of a twist to the idea of the passage. And of course, with that, let us begin. On to question number 5. The author mentions Tanzania's Hadza community to illustrate. So, what has been the reason? We know for a fact that the author has mentioned the contemporary Hadza of Tanzania, who had long been surrounded by farmers, and the fact that they knew they had alternatives and they rejected him. The passage also mentions that to Salin, this showed that foragers were not simply examples of human diversity or victimhood, but something more profound. And they demonstrated that societies make real choices. So, whichever is going to read around this will become my answer. How two vastly different ways of living and working were able to coexist in proximity? No, that is not what it is. We have to understand that it was the kind of thing that, they chose for themselves. The fact that it was not something which had to be, it was not the kind of idea wherein they wanted to be slated as victims, or it were examples of human diversity. There was something much more much more in depth that they had, which of course showed that society can make real choices. So we have to have an answer which is going to speak about them making the real choice. Now, how two vastly different ways of living and working were able to coexist in proximity, that's not what we are looking for. That for Raja communities, lifestyles derived not from ignorance but about alternatives, but from their own choice. Yes, we wanted something which is going to be around their own choice. So B is definitely an answer for us. That hunter-gatherer communities' subsistence level techniques equipped them to survive well in contemporary times. No, that's not why the mention of the community is being done. How pre-agrarian societies did not hamper the emergence of more advanced agrarian practices in contiguous communities. Again, it's not about the pre-agrarian. We're simply asking what has been the purpose or what has been the reason as to why the Hadza community has been highlighted. So clearly the answer over here will have to be B. Always make sure, guys, you look or you have a perception of the option as to what you're looking for and then look for the answers. It makes our job a lot more easier. The author of the passage mentions Galbraith's The Affluent Society too. Okay, now what has been the significance or what has been the reason for the reference to the Affluent Society? Now, in the very fourth paragraph, we have a line that says that with its title's nod towards the affluent society, the passage notes that Salin's essay title is a subtle acknowledgement of Galbraith's renowned critique of American post-war abundance and social disparities. This clearly goes to suggest that Salin's alignment with Galbraith's perspective, the fact that Salin's ideas harmonize with Galbraith's condemnation to the contemporary societies of consumerism and inequality. So the reason why he's used this is because he wants to talk about the fact that both of them complemented each other and showed the kind of inequalities that, of course, came up with, condemned severely the contemporary society around consumerism and inequality. So I think there is only one answer which is pretty loud. It's just popping out of the rest of it. And the correct answer will have to be option B. Like I said, the moment we understand what you're looking for, we know what the answer is. Now, to contrast the materialistic nature of contemporary growth paths with a pacifist content, no, he had a condemning content. So this can't be. Show how Galbraith's theories refute, no, there was no refute, they were both hand in glove. Document the influence of Galbraith's cynical views. No, he did not have any cynical view. In fact, Salin was pretty much, in accordance with what Galbraith had. So this can't be the answer either, which means the correct answer will have to be option B. Now, the author of the passage criticizes Salin's essay for it. Of course, there's been criticism. Towards the last paragraph, we see that the author has mentioned, and I quote, viewed in today's context, of course, not every aspect of the essay has aged well. So not everything, sits well with us. While acknowledging the violence of colonialism, racism, and dispossession, it does not thematize them as heavily as we might today. So, although Salin does mention racism and colonialism, but only gives a very cursory treatment on these. So, what has been the kind of criticism? The fact that there's only been a cursory sort of, a treatment that has been given to these, and the fact that these have, of course, not aged well. So A says cursory treatment of the effects of racism and colonialism on society is pretty much an answer. Outdated values regarding present day forages versus now. He does not criticize it because they're outdated values. It's just that they have not aged well. That means not everything has, been able to find place in today's times as well. So they're not outdated, just few of them. Critique of anthropologists who disparage the choices of foragers in today. Again, you have to understand that not every aspect of the essay, which means a lot still holds validity. So all of these, of course, are very strong words: failure, critique, outdated. But when I say a cursory treatment, it means it takes into account that not every aspect. So sometimes just one word is what is enough for us to know what the answer is likely to be, and that's just what we had here. We can infer from Salin's main goal in writing his essay was to. So why exactly did he write the passage? Now, we know for a fact that Salin's essays aim to represent a very conceptual challenge of modern economic norms and the bourgeois individuals. It tends to serve both as a philosophical and a political endeavor, acting as a thought experiment that encouraged readers to imagine alternative possibilities beyond the confines of capitalist society. Obviously, through all of this, Salin sought to reflect upon the kind of, acquisitive natures of the capitalism while also showing the successful examples of non-materialistic communities. So we're simply going to see which of the following is going to take this into regard. Now, put forth the view that despite egalitarian origins, economic progress brings greater inequality and social hierarchy. Now, egalitarian means something which is equal. Now, this misinterprets the essay of Salin as it does not suggest in any way that economic progress originated from egalitarian principles. So this is out of scope altogether, can't be my answer. Counter. Now, the next one goes to say that it is to counter Galbraith's pessimistic view of the inevitability of the capitalist trajectory of economic growth. Now, again, B cannot be the answer because the passage clarifies that Salin's essay's title is a nod to Galbraith's work, indicating his agreement. It is not a pessimistic view. Not my answer. Highlight the fact that while we started off as a fairly contented egalitarian people, we have progressively degenerated into materialism. Now, this is again inaccurate because the passage does not in any way say that Farage maintained an egalitarian society, nor does the essay of Salin. So, this, of course, cannot stand true. So, there's only one option that remains: hold a mirror to an acquisitive society with examples of other communities that have chosen successfully to be non materialistic, like the ones in Tanzania. So, of course, the answer will have to be option D here. I hope this was also something that you understood absolutely well. And with that, let us move on to the next passage that we have. All right, guys, let's get on to the next passage. Again, first things first, let's discuss the idea of the passage. So now the passage discusses the resurgence of wolves in Lozère, a rural region in southern France, and the resulting tensions between environmentalists and the local farmers. Once eradicated in 1930 through hunting and poisoning, wolves began returning in the 90s by crossing the Alps from Italy. Their comeback is seen by conservationists as a positive indicator of ecological restoration. For the farmers, it threatens livestock and their livelihoods, leading to renewed calls for control measures. The return of the wolves is linked to broader rural transformations. Depopulation, the decline of industries like farming and mining, forest expansion, and a drop in hunting activities have all created conditions more favorable to wildlife. Forest cover in France has significantly increased, now covering nearly one-third of the mainland, while the number of active hunters has dwindled. The legal protection of wolves, along with monitoring by NGOs, has further enabled their population growth. As wolves move closer to populated areas, conflict is intensifying. While farmers suffer real losses, the wolves' return is also a support to rural economies through tourism, which, such as the wolf parks. The issue strengthens a broader rural divide between traditional livelihoods and modern ecological values. So, a very popular and a very, in sync sort of a passage that we have, the kind of issues that we keep listening in today's times as well. Easy to understand. And with that, let us get on to the questions. Which of the following is not contributed to the growing wolf population in Lozère? So it has to be a reason that is not a reason or not contributing. The granting of the protected status to wolves in Europe, of course, that is one of the reasons as to why they're increasing. This can't be the shutting down of the royal office of the Lupari. Now, of course, the third line, the third paragraph, the last line says that that they were mostly protected status of the wolf in Europe. So this, of course, marks A as the answer. If you go to option B, now anything that says the shutting down of the royal office in the Lupari, I mean, this has nothing to do with growing of the wolf population. So we can reserve this. An increase in woodlands and forest cover in Lozère, of course, this was also a reason as to why the wolves increased. A decline in the rural population. Now, all of these, of course, we discussed while chatting around the idea. So both of these were reasons, which means the correct answer becomes option D over here. Let's get to the next one. Now, on to question number 10. It says, the author presents a possible economic solution to an existing issue facing Lozère that takes into account divergent and competing interest of. So who are the two parties whose interest, of course, are at stake? So we know for a fact that in the entire passage, the main contenders were, of course, the farmers and the environmentalists. So there will have to be only one answer, and that's going to be option C. These were the two stakeholders. On to question number 11. Which of the following statement, if true, would weaken the author's claim? So now for us to be able to know what exactly it is, we need to find that there is some sort of coexistence that happens. That is, we have to make sure that the rise in the wolf, of course, it's an ecological comeback, and the fact that the livelihood has also been taken care of. So if you want to weaken this, we of course want to talk about the fact that we don't want wolves anymore. So let's see which of the following. The old mining sites in Lozère is now being used as grazing pasture for the sheep. So maybe, that can be a safe place. This strengthens the idea. Having migrated out in the last century, wolves are now returning to Lozère. Well, of course, this is what the passage is about. Unemployment concerns of the residents of Lozère. Yes, because if they eat up the livestock, what exactly would they do? This is also strengthening. Now, wolves' attack on tourists in Lozère are on the rise, of course. The one thing that is getting money are being attacked. So, of course, now is where we'll have to deplete the wolf population. So, this is definitely weakening because in the passage we wanted to get back the scale of the wolf. The inhabitants of Lozère have to grapple with all of the following problems except. So, one of it is not a problem. We have to see which of the following is not a problem. Decline in the number of hunting license, of course. Now, if you go back to the passage, you know for a fact that decline in the number of license is mentioned to give a reason for increase in the forest area, but it is not a concern for the inhabitants. Likely to be an answer. Rural communication infrastructure, definitely a problem. Livestock losses, yes, a problem. Educational facility, yes, a problem. All of these have been mentioned in the first para of the passage itself. So, which means the correct answer will have to be option A. And with that, a very easy and entertaining passage comes to an end. Let's get on to the next passage, everybody. All right, guys, let's get on to the next passage and try and understand what do we have in the passage. Now, first things first, of course, we're going to discuss the idea of the passage. Now, this passage argues that human traits and societal outcomes, like behavior, economies, and life expectancy, are shaped by both geographic and non-geographic factors. Geographic factors include climate, soil, topography, and the distribution of plants and animals, while of course the non-geographic ones include culture, history, and individual choices. There have been examples that highlight the distinction. Differences between the North and South Korea are due to political decisions, not geography, whereas the development of fur clothing in the Arctic or the absence of agriculture in Aboriginal Australia is clearly tied to geographic and biological constraints. Australia, for instance, lacked domesticable native species, which explains its pre-colonial reliance on hunting and gathering. The author criticizes that academic tendency to dismiss geographic explanation as geographic determinism, noting that while cultural and historical and individual factors are routinely accepted, despite their own problematic past, for example, racist theories, geographic explanations remain unfairly stigmatized. This bias is partly due to geography's historical misuse in racist theories, historians' preferences for contingency and human agency, and the fact that geographic arguments require technical knowledge often lacking in the training of non-geographers. Ultimately, the passage calls for a very balanced view that recognizes geography as a legitimate and important influence on human development alongside culture, history, and personal choices. So that is exactly what the passage is about. And with that, let us get on to the questions to be able to see what exactly should be the answers. Now, moving on to question number 13, it says all of the following are advanced by the authors as reasons why non-geographers disregard geographic influences on human phenomena except. So, three of these are a reason, one of it is not a reason. We have to find the one that is not a reason as to why non-geographers disregard geographic, influences. So, three are a reason. Which of the following is not? Let's see. A. Dismissal of explanations that involve geographical causes for human nature. Now, this is very likely to be an answer. If you go back to the passage, the author criticizes non-geographical scholars for dismissing geographical factors for human nature, behavior, human nature in paragraph 3, and it provides a reason in the subsequent. But this is not the reason. This is in fact the statement, right? All of these are not, the question specifically goes about over here by saying that we need a proper reason for it. This is definitely not a reason. We can have A reserved. Belief in the central role of humans unrelated to physical surroundings and influencing phenomena. This is a reason. Lingering impressions of past geographic analysis. Definitely a reason. Disciplinary training, which typically does not include technical knowledge. Definitely a reason, which means the correct answer becomes A, just because the question stem required us to know which of the following is not a reason. Next, all of the following can be inferred from the passage except, again, give me the one answer that is false. And inference is always from the said about the unsaid. So we simply have to see which of the following are said and which of the following is unsaid. Individual diktat and contingency were not the causal factors for the use of fur clothing in some very cold climates. Now, this is absolutely true as per the passage, and it can be inferred from the 5th paragraph, which says the development of warm fur clothes among the Inuit living north of the Arctic Circle was not because one influential Inuit leader persuaded the other to adopt warm fur clothes for no good environmental reason. So, of course, this can be inferred, not an answer. Agricultural practices changed drastically in the Australian continent after it was colonized. This can also be inferred from the 2nd paragraph, wherein the line says, instead, the crops and domestic animals that now make Australia a food and wool exporter are all non-native, purely Eurasian species such as sheep, wheat, and grapes brought to Australia by the overseas colonists. So yes, this can be inferred, not an answer for me. Several academic studies of human phenomena in the past involved racist interpretations. I think while discussing, we spoke about this. This can be inferred from the fourth paragraph in the line which reads, I mean, the same line which has the idea that says many genetic, historical, psychological, and anthropological explanations advanced a century ago were also racist. So clearly, by default, through the technique of elimination, there's only one question that remains. While most human phenomena result from culture and individual choice, some have biogeographic remains. This is what is going to be the answer because the passage does talk about cultural and individual choices affecting human as well as the biogeographical factors, but there is no comparison to which type of factor was more prevalent. So, of course, that is not what we can identify. So, the correct answer becomes D, which is a wrong inference. The author criticizes scholars who are not geographers for all of the following reasons except. Okay. Now, of course, we have to find out again. He's criticized the scholars for it not. I mean, it says that he's criticized all of those who are not geographers for all of the following reasons. So we have to tell the one reason which he's not been criticized for. So we know that, the reasons are beginning with first denouncing of geographical determinism. I think that is what option B speaks about, mentioned in paragraph 3. Stressing the role of contingency, which was, of course, a favorite word among the historians based on individual decision and choices. This has been mentioned in paragraph 5, which means option A also seems to be a criticism. Their lack of detailed knowledge about geographical factors. I think that is what option D says, something that has been mentioned in the last paragraph. So, which means the only thing which is an exception becomes option C. Their outdated interpretation of past cultural and historical phenomena. That is, of course, not the reason of criticism. Okay, on to question number 16. Now let's see. It says the examples of the Inuit and the Aboriginal Australians are offered in the passage to show. So, of course, we wanted to show how these can actually dictate human behavior and, of course, a lot of culture. So, that is the kind of idea that has been talked about. So, we'll simply see which of the following is going to be the answer. Now, when I talk about option D, it says how environmental factors led to comparatively divergent paths in livelihood and development. Now, the examples of these, of course, are offered in the passage to show geographical factors that lead to different human behavior. But the main point is just not the environmental factors leading to it, but then the fact that these influence human behavior as well. So while this is also very close, we have C that goes about by saying how physical circumstances can dictate human behavior and culture. This takes into account more of what the correct answer should be. So between C and D, of course, C is a stiffer option. It's a better choice. So we can eliminate D. Now, how human resourcefulness across cultures and adapting to their surroundings. Now, A will not be because it talks about human resourcefulness, which is not the point of the mention of the two. That despite geographical isolation, traditional societies were self-sufficient and adaptive. Now, B cannot be because there is no such mention of geographical isolation. This is out of scope. So, which means the correct answer is going to be option C. I hope all of these passages were absolutely clear to you. And now let's move on to the next set of questions altogether. Starting from question number 17, now what we have are classic para-completions. So there is a sentence that has been given to us, and basis the sentence, we have four options, and we have to see which of the following is going to fit or where exactly is it going to fit the best. Now let's see what do we have. Now the sentence is the discovery helps to explain archaeological similarities between the Paleolithic people of China, Japan, and the Americans. So of course it is the discovery, so which means whatever should talk about it should have the kind of vibe of a discovery. Let's begin. The researchers also uncovered an unexpected genetic link between Native Americans and Japanese people. Dash. Now, the moment I just use the two people, I cannot add China, of course, because it is just about the Americans and the Japanese. We have to have a more generic idea to be able to inculcate China as well. So, of course, first is not going to be the option. A stands eliminated. I mean, option 1, which is option C, stands eliminated. During the declassiation period, another group branched out from northern coastal China and traveled to Japan. Okay, now is where the Chinese introduction has happened. But then, of course, dash. We were surprised, which means this seems to be, I mean, the continuing line will have to be something wherein maybe a researcher or somebody who has been a prominent person in it has quoted. But this line has no such mention. So, of course, the second will not have it because we have to give way to the fact that we want to have a researcher say the prominent line. So 2 is also not going to be an option, which means option B also stands eliminated. Now, We were surprised to find that this ancestral source also contributed to the Japanese gene pool, especially the indigenous anus, says Lee. Dash. And then it says they, which means this was a discovery for them. This is where the epiphany happened. The next line, since it talks about discovery and the amalgamation of the three people, so of course, this is the perfect place wherein we can approach and we can probably put this line. So now the discovery helps to explain archaeological similarities between Paleolithic people of China and all of these. They shared similarity. They over here makes a noun pronoun mandatory pair, which means the perfect fit is going to be option 3, which is option A over here. So again, all of our rules of the mandatory pair is what plays fair, and that is what you should stick to. Let's get to question number 18 again. This philosophical cut at one's core belief values and way of life is difficult enough. So this means again there has to be some demonstration, there has to be some way wherein we are trying to be talking about, and it has to be a philosophical cut. Let's see. The experience of reading philosophy is often disquieting. When reading philosophy, the values around which one has heretofore organized one's life may come to look provincial, flatly wrong, or even evil. So then we have dash. Now this philosophical cut at one's core belief is a way of life is difficult enough. But that's we have not still talked about how it is difficult. So one is not going to have the mention here. So of course A is not an answer. When beliefs previously held as truths were rendered implausible, new beliefs, values, and way of thinking were required. Now, dash. So obviously, I want to speak somewhere wherein, we go to say that it was this dissection. It was this, this idea wherein something prevailed, and then of course the thought process was difficult. And since the passage says the given sentence is a philosophical cut at one's core belief, it was difficult enough. Obviously, they're suggesting that now there's something more worse. So something that has to contradict the idea, right? So of course, maybe here is where we can have the idea punched in. So yes, B is likely to be an answer because when I say this philosophical cut, and then what's worse, philosophers admonish each other to remain unsutured until such time as defensible new answers is revealed. Now that we've gotten exactly where the answer is, the correct answer over here is going to be option D. There is no reason to read further. We have to be smart. We only have limited time to ourselves. On to question number 19. We have 5 jumble sentences. Identify the odd sentence. So the best way to do an odd sentence is you make your parajumble, you make your series. Whichever does not fit into the series clearly will be your odd sentence. Or another way is whichever is not going to fit into the rhyme and rhythm of the passage, the theme of the passage becomes an odd statement. We'll have to read all the statements. Now, having an appreciation for the working of another's mind is considered a prerequisite for natural language acquisition, strategic social interaction, and reflexive thought and moral judgment. Okay. It is the theory of mind, though which some scholars prefer to call it mentalizing or mind reading, which is important for the development of one's core. Okay. So we've talked about a theory of mind over here. Though we must speculate about its evolutionary origin, we do have indicators that the capacity evolved sometime in the last few years. Okay. This capacity develops from the early beginning of the first year of the life of the adult's fast and often effortless understanding to one's thought. Okay. One of the most fascinating human capabilities is the ability to perceive. Now, I know that 3 of these have to be a mandatory pair because all of these are talking about each other. And then when I say other people's behavior in terms of the mental states, now having an appreciation of the work of another person's mind. Now, this also speaks about the cognitive part of it. The one thing which is, of course, a clear cut odd sentences too, because nowhere did we talk about the theory of mind. All of these are just states of mind that has been talked about. So, of course, 2 does not fit into the theme. We're interpreting the mind's behavior, but 2 is about, this theory altogether, which is about the mind, of course, but it's not fitting into the sense of statement. So, the correct answer becomes 2. Now we have the sentence. We again have to identify the odd sentence in the question. Let's get on to the 20th one. Now in English, there is no systematic rule of naming the numbers after 10. We have 11, 12, and then the 13, 14, 15, and so on. Even more confusing, some English words invert the numbers. So this talks about numbers, this talks about numbers. They refer to the words 14, puts 4 first, and then it appears, and even though it appears last. It can take children a while to learn all these words and understand that 14 is different from 40. Okay. still, goes on to the idea of course, what the numbers are going to be. For multiples of 10, English speakers switch to different patterns, 20, 30. If you didn't know the word 11, you might just be okay. Now, clearly over here, as confusing as it is, the odd sentence is going to be option 3, because all of this talk from an English perspective. This talks about a child's embracing. So, of course, the passage speaks about the unsystematic ways in which the numbers are named, but the third one only focuses on the child's approach to it. That's not what the right, I mean, the in light the passage gives spotlight on. So, of course, the correct answer, which is the odd statement, is going to be question statement number 3. Out of the 4, we now have to do a proper sequence, subjective, theta version, parajumbles. Again, read, make mandatory pairs, and bam, we have the answer. What precisely are the unusual elements that make a particular case so attractive to a certain kind of audience? It might be a particular savage or unfathomable level of depravity. Very often, it has something to do with the precise amount of mystery involved. Unsolved and perhaps unsolvable cases offer something that ordinary murder doesn't. Why are some crimes destined for perpetual re examination and other locked to permanent obscurity? Now, of the lot, I know that the first will have to be 4, because it's like, why are some crimes supposed to be like this? The next is going to be, what precisely will be these unusual elements that make a particular case? Still furthering on the idea of crimes. Now, because it is a question, the next will have to be an answer, and which is why it might be a particular savage or unfathomable. Now, we know that 2 and 3 were a mandatory pair because it talks about the mystery involved, and of course, unsolved and perhaps unsolvable. It continues on the idea of the mysterious angle. So, the correct version is going to be 4, 1, 2, and 3. Pretty easy, unlike what CAT gives out. Next, algorithms hosted on the internet are assessed by many. So biases in AI models have resulted in much larger impact, adversely affecting far larger groups of people. Although algorithmic bias is a popular term, the foundation of such bias is not algorithm, but in the data. Algorithms are not biased, data is, as algorithms merely reflect persistent patterns that are present in the training. Despite their widespread impact, so this is an impact statement that says the impact of biased decision made by humans is localized and geographically confined. But with the advent, but it says with the advent of AI, the impact of such decision is spread over a much wider scale. So now let's see. Of the lot, we know that our obvious opener over here becomes statement number 4. Why do we have 4? Because it says the impact of all of this, the impact of such decisions spread over a much wider space. And then we talk about what exactly is it. Then comes the kind of algorithm that is, of course, involved. Now, I know for a fact that 1 and 2 were definitely a mandatory pair because they continue on the idea of algorithmic bias. So 1 and 2, then of course, whatever remains becomes 3. So the answer becomes 4, 1, 2, and 3. I hope all of these were absolutely clear to you. And with that, let us simply move on to the last 2 questions that we have, which are about paracompletions altogether. On to the second last question that we have. Now, of course, these are summary questions. We have to read the paragraph and we have to see which of the following is going to be the most appropriate summary of the lot. Now, manipulating information was a feature of history long before modern journalism established rules of integrity. A record dates back to the ancient Rome when Antony met Cleopatra and its political enemy Octavian launched a smear campaign against him with short, sharp slogans written upon coins. The perpetrator became the first Roman emperor, and fake news had allowed Octavian to hack the Republican system once and for all. But the 21st century has seen the weaponization of information on an unprecedented scale. Powerful new technology makes the fabrication of content simple, and social networks amplify falsehood peddled by states, populist politicians, and dishonest corporate entities. The platform has become fertile ground for computational propaganda, trolling, and troll armies. Okay, so now that we read about the paragraph, we know that the main points are, of course, about the information of manipulation has existed for before the modern journalism integrity rules. We then have Octavians as mentioned as an example of the ancient Rome to support the point. And of course, lastly, we want the 21st century technology has led to fabrication of context for propaganda and trolling of states, politicians, and corporates. We will see which uses all of the 3. Disinformation, which is mediated through technology today, is not new and has existed. Now, A cannot be an answer because it has nothing talking about technology mediating disinformation, not the summary. People needed to become critical of what they read since historically weaponization of information has led to Corruption. Now, again, this cannot also be an answer because people's point of view, what action they need, is not mentioned, not an answer. Octavian used fake news to manipulate people and obtain power and influence, just as the others. Now, though, of course, this is true, it is only being used as an example. Again, not the main idea, so of course, it will have to be D. Use of information for attaining power, a practice that is as old as the Octavian era, is currently fueled by technology. Captures exactly the 3 points that we were looking for. And on to the last question for the understanding, the analysis altogether. Colonialism is not modern phenomena. World history is full of examples of one society gradually expanding by incorporating adjacent territory and settling its people on newly conquered territory. In the 16th century, colonialism changed decisively because of technological developments in navigation that began to connect more remote parts to the world. The modern European colonialism project emerged when it became possible to move large number of people across the ocean and to maintain political control in spite of geographical dispersion. The term colonialism is used to describe the process of European settlement, violent dispossessions, and political domination over the rest of the world, including the Americas, Australias, and part of Africa and Asia. So the kinds of things that we want is colonialism is not modern phenomena, existed over time, gained momentum due to the advancement of navigational technologies, and colonialism is the process of European settlement over the rest of the world. Whichever will take this becomes my answer. Colonialism surged in the 16th century due to the advancement. Now, enabling British settlements abroad and global dominance. Now, A talks about the date, but it is just not specifically, it is European, it is not British, can't be an answer. B. As a result of developments in navigation technology, European colonialism led to displacement of indigenous population and global political changes in the 16th century. Now, B cannot be an answer because the passage talks about European being able to move their people across geographies. It does not mention anything about the displacement of the indigenous. Wrong. Technological advancement and navigation in the 16th century transformed colonialism, enabling Europeans to establish settlement and exert political dominance over distant very much has into account all things that we are looking about. Definitely captures, let's reserve. Colonialism, conceptualized in the 16th century, allowed colonizers to expand their territory, establish settlement, and exercise political power. Now, colonialism existed for, of course, many centuries. It was not conceptualized, it was not formed in the 16th century. This is wrong, which means the correct answer will have to be option C. And with that, we come to an end. If there is anything that you feel you could have gotten a better explanation for, or you feel there's still confusion that arises, please feel free to ping me on the Telegram ID, which is Suyukti_Sate, and I would really be honored to be able to help you with whatever be the kind of confusion that you have. With this, we come to an end to the 2023 CAT first lot paper discussion. I will see you guys again with another paper discussion, but until then, I hope you're clear and that you now know where and what is it that you need to do to score the best. Until next time, everybody, have a great day. Thank you so much for your valuable time.